The overall goal is still the same, to score more points than the other team. But beyond that, a whole lot is different this season when it comes to men's college basketball. In August, the NCAA Rules Oversight Panel approved a couple dozen tweaks to the rules. Some obvious, like the shot clock, which was reduced from 35 to 30 seconds, and the number of timeouts trimmed from 5 to 4. But rules changes focused on the physicality of play, among others, require an expert's explanation. And to help us make sense of all the different rule changes this year, a man very well versed in them because it's his job to be John Cahill, Latham native, who is the coordinator of officials for the Big East Conference. First of all, thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me, Kelly. I appreciate it.
You've been in this game for a very long time, and you were telling me earlier that there have never been so many changes in one season in the time you've been involved in college basketball.
Yeah, this is the first time in my memory that I can ever recall the Rules Committee taking as many actions as they did in the offseason. And in addition, putting an emphasis on a number of calls that officials will make to take physicality out of the game. So it's going to be a challenge for my guys this year.
And before we talk about the effect the rules might have, let's talk about the motivation in the first place to make these changes. And where did that come from?
Well, basically the Rules Committee meets each spring, starting around the Final Four, and takes suggestions from various constituencies within the game, coaches, media, officials at times. And they developed a theme that they had three purposes in mind. One, they wanted to fasten the game up a little bit and make the pace of play a little quicker. They wanted to reduce the number of stoppages, but they also wanted to take physicality out of the game and more or less create a more balanced playing court for offense and defense. So the biggest emphasis for me as a coordinator of officials is to make sure that the officials call the game as the rules are written and to take physicality out of it.
Is a lot of that with the fan in mind, where they want to see more scoring and quicker games, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I do believe that the media was responsible for imposing their will, I would say, to make sure that the scoring was increased and there was more quick pace of play to the game.
Scoring had been on the decline for many years.
Yep, and the statistics that I got from the NCAA through the first month scoring is showing a rise. So it's accomplishing its purpose. It's going to be a long-term type process. I don't think that you'll see the end result for a couple of seasons, but I think we're off to a good start.
As the coordinator of officials for the Big East Conference, you have more than 40 officials that you're responsible for and evaluating their performance on the court. What have you heard from them? Has their job been more difficult trying to adapt?
Yeah, it's definitely a difficult time to be an official, especially for my veteran officials who've been officiating with a particular style, more so based on advantage, disadvantage than strict compliance with the rules. It's a challenge for them. I think that everybody has bought in, players, coaches, and officials, and they realize that this is something that's going to take some adjustment by all the parties involved. But my officials have bought in. They have to buy in because the NCAA has dictated that to me, and I've dictated that to them. So, you know, people always worry about officials having accountability, but each of my officials wants to be on the floor in March when the NCAA tournament is going on. And if they don't comply with the mandates that the NCAA has set forth, they won't be on the floor.
In the NCAA tournament, something that you've done many times in your career, 7 Final Fours, more than anybody. What would be more challenging now that you can see it from both ways? Being on the court and trying to adapt, or being in the position you're in now and trying to keep track of others adapting?
I think it would be more difficult for me to officiate at this time. Yeah, I grew up in an era where it was more physical type game, that it was more an advantage, disadvantage type style of officiating. And it would be difficult for me to adapt. I'm not saying I couldn't do it, but I think it would be more difficult.
Do you miss it at all, being on the court?
There have been a few occasions over the last couple of seasons when I've been in attendance at games where the atmosphere gets rocking and rolling and the adrenaline starts to flow, where I miss it. But overall, I'm kind of happy with the decision I made. It was a good opportunity for me to stay in the game, and I'm enjoying the position that I'm in.
Was is the travel the hardest part?
Without a doubt. The travel wears you down. People who don't travel think it's luxurious, but when you're traveling on a daily basis and you're fighting airplane crowds and you're getting up first thing in the morning to get the first flight out, it does take a toll on you physically.
I'm sure you've got to be thick-skinned to do the job because you hear it from fans, you hear it from coaches. But now with these rule changes, I imagine there are probably times when officials are getting yelled at when they're doing the right thing, but people don't realize yet they're doing the right thing.
Yeah, that's a very astute observation on your part, and I happened to notice it this past weekend. I watched a lot of games from the various tournaments throughout the country, and in the early part of the season, all of the media was on board, and I didn't notice in watching games that the media or the fans were reacting negatively to these types of calls. But you know, there was one particular game over the weekend down in the Orlando tournament where a number of fouls were called just because of the style of play of the two teams, and the officials were doing exactly what they had been directed to do, but it was causing the game to slow down and drag out a little bit. And one of the commentators took it upon himself to criticize the officials for that, and to his credit, the other commentator interjected himself and said, hey, you can't blame these guys. They're doing what they've been told to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's going to be a challenge. I think the game will be better long term, but it's not something that's going to happen overnight.
Where do you think it goes from here? We saw changes in the women's game that went to 4 quarters, and now men's college basketball is really the only level playing halves anywhere. Do you think that changes at some point?
Well, there has been some movement towards trying to make the game more uniform. The college men's game moved from a 35-second clock to a 30-second clock. Internationally and on the pro level, it's a 24-second clock. So there was some real consideration to take it down to that point. My concern with the change in the shot clock is that teams are going to put token pressure on the backcourt, and so when the team advances the ball to the front court, they're probably going to have somewhere between 22 and 23 seconds to get into their offense. And if a coach of the defensive team decides to put up a zone or a matchup type of a defense, it's going to further delay an offensive team from getting into their patterns or the plays that they want to run. And what happens is the college games, teams in general, don't have the number of athletes on their teams that can create shots for themselves at the end of the shot clock. So my fear is that we'll wind up with a lot poorer shot selection than you would see if the shot clock were at 35.
Can you sit back and watch a basketball game without thinking about the refs and watching the decisions that they're making?
No, that's kind of difficult. You know, even when I was officiating on the floor, people would say to me, such and such a player for a particular team had a great game, and you know, did you see this move or that move? And you know, I had a general idea that a particular player might have been scoring a lot of points, but I didn't pay attention to who it was. He was just a guy in a light uniform or a dark uniform making an athletic play. You know.
Well, thanks so much for stopping by. We really appreciate the knowledge and having you here.
Thank you.